So now we get the exciting task of actually entering into the rules for discernment. Now, the first rule for discernment is, it might be best actually if you can pull this up on Google and just to Google 14 rules for discernment and just to look at the concrete text. I'll read it in full, but it's definitely easy to have kind of your eyes on it as I'm reading through it. And unfortunately, I'm still not tech savvy enough to know how to put those rules visually on the screen, but if someone is watching this and knows how to do that, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to take your wisdom and advice and counsel. So here is the first rule for discernment. Ignatius says, "In persons who are going from mortal sin to mortal sin, the enemy is ordinarily accustomed to propose apparent pleasures to them, leading them to imagine sensual delights and pleasures in order to hold them more and make them grow in their vices and sins. In these persons, the good spirit uses a contrary method, stinging and biting their conscience through their rational power of moral judgment." Now, fully realize that there's a lot right there. So what we're going to do is actually break this apart and to make it a little bit more digestible, part by part. Now, the first rule of St. Ignatius is very important, as it alerts the person to the reality that there are two directions that the soul is moving towards, right? There is no room for apathy. It's either you're being led by the Lord or by the enemy. Now, without recognition of this reality, there really is no need for discernment. For the point of discerning is you have to distinguish between two different things. And if there's not a good and an evil voice, an angel on each shoulder, there's really nothing that you're discerning. You're just thinking. Thus, Ignatius's first rule is trying to distinguish for the soul which direction it's moving. And with that movement, he is showing that there are definitive differences at this point that can be recognized. Now, one of the examples that I absolutely love to use for this is St. Augustine. St. Augustine is kind of the model for conversion and transformation of life. He was alive in the late 300s, 4th century. St. Augustine constantly had the enemy proposing different things to him. Sexual experience. In fact, he has this great quote of, "Make me chaste, Lord, but not quite yet." He wasn't done playing around. Intellectually vain pursuits, trying to find out like the best philosophy of the time, jumping ships to different religions, different philosophers, trying to find the best way to navigate the world. Then there was worldly prestige, as he wanted to be acknowledged and recognized for the things he was doing. And of course, adventure. He had gone all over the place just trying to figure out exactly what was the most fun in life. Now, all these things allured St. Augustine, and he followed them. But in his famous book, The Confessions, which was actually written at the end of his life, because people had thought he was such a saint, such a holy man, and he was like, no, I'm not. Like, you have no idea my background. And so he actually wrote the Confessions as kind of a testimony to say, look, who I am today is not who I always was. So in the Confessions, he comments in this autobiography how other voices were being proposed to him, but he did not find them as appealing as they required no sacrifice. And the fact that there was a voice inside that was calling for sacrifice, which meant for more, was actually something that stimulated his heart. And here is where this first part of St. Ignatius's rule is actually really pertinent. Ignatius says, the evil spirit is proposing apparent pleasures and leading souls to imagine sensual delights in order to hold them more and make them grow in their vices and sin. So the best image, right, is Golem going, "My precious," is literally the pleasures of this world gathering people to themselves and saying, "Yes, I hold you and you cannot escape." Whereas the good spirit, in contrast, is stinging and biting the conscience through rational powers and moral judgment. So literally, right, you can see the Lord is engaging one of those incredible gifts that he gave us, which is natural reason, to choose between what is good and what is bad. And the good spirit, right, he's stinging and biting the conscience. It's kind of like that moment where you're like, I really shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. Now, this is exactly what happens in every soul on the brink of substantial conversion. The good spirit is convincing the heart that you need to change. Something needs to be reconsidered in your life. But the world is like desperately saying, no, 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 you're fine. Just go to an ease of being. Don't worry about this. Because the evil one knows how alluring the things are of this world. In fact, this is part of the word lure, right, which we use for fishing, is a lure, right? It's not actually like something that's good, right? The lure is proposed to a fish that it's like, oh, this is a good thing to eat. It bites on it, and then it's hooked. The enemy uses the pleasures of this world for the same thing. He lures us in, and we get hooked. Now, as I had referenced in the first video about C.S. Lewis, he writes this amazing book called The Screwtape Letters. And just a little tidbit of history that's really interesting is, after he wrote this, he dedicated it to J.R.R. Tolkien. And he told Tolkien this. And Tolkien goes, "You will not put my name on that book. I cannot believe that you would give this in honor of me." And it's a book all about two demons having a conversation. And Tolkien was horrified that his name would be on that, because he said it was just too dark. But in the end, if you look in the right before the table of contents, sure enough, C.S. Lewis did give that book in honor of J.R.R. Tolkien. But in this, you have the two demons, Wormwood and Screwtape, and they're talking about the best way to tempt a human. And one of the things that Screwtape is advising Wormwood to do is you really have to go after their passions, after their senses. Because if you try to work in the intellectual, the enemy has too much room. And of course, the enemy he's referring to is God. He said the enemy has too much latitude when you're working with natural reason. So just stay on the base level. Stay on the senses, and that soul will be yours for all eternity. Now, this sad reality is not uncommon in this generation. In fact, Bishop Cousins gave me this very interesting meditation. He said, so often in our modern world, right, we'll say this line, "Oh, don't worry, it's fine," or, it's not a big deal, just do whatever you want to, and, if it feels good, just do it. And what's so interesting, right, about us saying these things is it's literally dulling that biting and stinging of the conscience that says, this is not okay. And so even when immoral behaviors in this world, what is the things that people often say is, well, just accept me. Just make it okay. Don't discriminate. Don't say, I don't agree with your behavior. You have to accept what we're doing. Which is really interesting, right? Because as we accept whatever the behavior is, if it's immoral, obviously we don't want to be prejudiced or, any of those kind of negative things that demean the human person. But in regards to morality, this is where it gets really interesting, is to actually say, you know what, I don't think I can agree with what you're doing, and it's okay that your conscience is stinging a little bit, because it might mean that the Lord is trying to lead you into something else, something more, something freer than you realize. Now, oftentimes, right, the reason why we can't rise above our sin or our temptation to sin is because we're really not accustomed to listening to that good voice. And no one really likes to feel that biting or stinging of the conscience. And so it's easier just to dull it down. But the dulling down doesn't necessarily mean more freedom. This is where, when we're actually praying for our loved ones' conversions, what we should actually be praying is, Lord, remove the obstacles that would hinder them from hearing your voice. Lord, allow them the strength of soul that when you prompt them, they are able to respond. Because we do believe, right, that God is speaking to every single heart. We just have to pray that the soul is strong enough to hear the voice, to respond, and then to reject the enemy. Now, this is really the first part of the rule of Ignatius, that there are two directions, two powers, and then there's that kind of nasty thing of free will that is interacting between the two. We actually have to choose one or the other. Ignatius of Loyola leaves no room for someone to remain neutral. Either an individual is moving from good to better, or from the present state to worse. No one is unaffected. And this is one of the guarantees of life, and we can experience this firsthand in the world we live in right now with the pandemic, right? There is no guarantees of a status quo. Things are constantly changing, even within the hour, that affect dramatically people's lives. And this is a good time in our own life to really think about the power of free will. Actions have consequences. And one bat taco in China has forever changed the face of our entire world. This also shows us that the choices we make towards proposals of our will actually matter as well. The proposal has no value in itself, but when we choose what is presented to us, it then begins to have value. So here's a bit of wisdom that a dear monk from the Benedictines out in Atchison, Kansas taught me. Brother Emmanuel gave me these beautiful words. He said, you know what, Father Nathan, what I found in life, I'm going to read this quote, either we live the drama of running away from Christ, or we live the drama of moving towards him. Either way, we are in the thralls of a dynamic interaction between Christ, either running from him or towards him. No one gets to escape the reality of Jesus. He speaks to the heart saying things like, are you really happy living this way? And can you continue to live with such inner emptiness? Can you tolerate being so unfulfilled every day of your life? Is not life meant to be more than this? And why do you hurt those you love and need you, living the way that you do? See, all of these are examples of the Lord speaking moral truths into our hearts and causing us to question our life and the decisions that we're making, which is to choose the good and to reject the bad. Now, Gerald Manley Hopkins, who's a great Jesuit poet, wrote this fascinating poem called The Hound of Heaven. And if you get a chance, I really highly recommend you look at it. The entire poem is kind of like this beautiful, rich imagery of God being a hound who is pursuing the soul to trying to get us into heaven. Now, here's an example of how this would work, practically speaking. Let's give an example of a high school student, right? He's in his senior year, living high on life. The whole world is filled with possibilities before him. He's lived really, really straight and narrow, lettered in varsity, quite popular, made good decisions, but he's been accepted to college. He's pretty much got his full ride set. He's got his circle of friends. He's moving on to the next one. So he starts to let his guard down a little bit. He's invited to a party. And so he initially feels the invitation to the party is like, oh, that's not a big deal. And then some of his friends that he hears are going are bringing kegs and things like this. And he's kind of like, I don't know if I should go. So there's the first moment. Inside of his head is this battle, right? Should I go knowing that there might be danger, or should I just kind of stay and not? I'm going to miss the experience, but I might preserve the virtue. And so in this, he has to make a decision. So let's say he goes to the party. Then he walks in the door of the party. And now the next threshold comes, right? Do I take a drink, underage, or do I just kind of interact with people? And so here's the next threshold, right? He's debating inside, and again, free will makes the decision. Boom, let's say he chooses to get a drink. So now he's socializing, taking a drink with his friends, and someone says, hey, have you ever tried this? And pulls out a bag of Molly, which is a drug if you don't know about that. And he's like, I really shouldn't, but he's already had a couple of drinks, so now his equilibrium between good and bad is not as great. So then he takes the drug. And then he's feeling so good, and this girl that he's always liked from science class is kind of hitting on him, and they're getting a little sloppy. And now the next threshold comes about some sort of promiscuous sexual action. Now, the reason I like this image is it shows these thresholds, right? And we all have these in our life where it's like there's this initial thing is, should I enter into this conversation with this person? I don't really know. And then, do I really need to share this? Okay, well, I don't know, but okay, I already shared it. Oh, I got even more. Like, I should share this. And then, I start to kind of drop some vulgarities and off-color humor. And so this kind of progressive nature, it sucks us in. But what we need to take note of is that biting and stinging of the conscience at each threshold is truly present. Now, in this example, what is so interesting is that the first movement of the heart, it seemed really harmless, right? It's just a party. Like, I can choose not to drink, I can go, it's just not a big deal. And the same thing true, right, is a lot of the initial inclinations to sin are very subtle. The enemy, as the scriptures tell us, is a prowling lion looking for souls to devour. He's a predator. So he's just kind of seeing what's the best lure to get them in. And yet our God, right, he also wants us for himself. He's that hound of heaven. And so he's proposing to us these kind of things that are like, you're meant for more. Can you just be okay with being at peace with me? Can you be okay not experiencing everything in this world? And he gives us these invitations, but they're so subtle because they have to be, right? Otherwise, we don't get to engage free will. He would take it away if we didn't have a choice. And so he does just propose, and we get to choose to actually will it. What the evil one works like is like a good salesman, right? Is he's like, I got this product, and you really want to try it, and everyone's life has been so much better since they've purchased this product of sin. Or can you see how much fun they're having and what you're going to miss out on? Or this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. You have to buy right now, or you're going to miss it. So the enemy is always working speedily, quickly, and wants us to buy what he is selling. Now, if you look at this story of the high school student, look at how many times the different forces were speaking, right? Good and evil. At each threshold, there were opportunities to choose one and reject one. Thus, we must realize that it is not a once and done thing. Sin is always kind of a perpetual thing, so is grace. Is we've just got to hit these thresholds and keep responding. So let's say we fall on the first one. It doesn't mean that we're doomed to all the consequent falls. Is we could actually say, hey, you know what? I really made a bad choice. I really shouldn't have done that. But I'm not going to keep on making bad choices. As the 12-step program encourages addicts who are recovering, just make the best next choice and let that be enough. And thus, there are constant proposals and there are constant choices in life. Now, notice also in this example that every time the good spirit is presenting a moral truth, that the enemy always makes it look lame or a bad decision. This is part of how the enemy works. He cannot use reason, right? It's not like you can rationally say, yeah, I really should sin. That is a great idea. It logically makes the most amount of sense. In fact, what the enemy wants us to do is to stay on, as Teresa of Avila talked about, that courtyard of the senses so that we don't actually go deep. When we start to engage our reason, which is supposed to be ordered to the good, we actually don't move to sin. Reason doesn't allow it. And so the enemy will never enter into that playing field. He wants to keep us on the pleasure thing, with things like vanity and pride and fear and curiosity. These are the sort of lower passions that the enemy loves to work in. Now, the reason why this rule is rule number 1 is because if an individual is not willing to listen to the good spirit, it actually can't progress to the next levels of discernment. Because if we say, hey, I'm not interested in actually engaging what Spirit's talking, there really is no more rules for us to follow because there's nothing to discern. We don't really care. However, if we're willing to start to watch this biting and stinging of the conscience, and then also too this kind of allurement to the pleasures and to resist them, we are at a prime spot to start to do some discernment of spirits. An individual who's not willing to look at this is not capable of discerning more complex things. But if one is, they must trust that God will give them the strength and courage to begin to navigate this. The soul is exponentially strengthened and given the resolve necessary to seek what is good and holy. So if we are indeed interested in it, God will provide the grace to kind of put fuel in our tank to push us on to making good decisions. It won't be easy. Virtue is never easy. But we do have to know is if we're willing to work with the good spirit, he also is willing to work with us. Oftentimes, right, and hopefully you've experienced this, right, when one of those moments of debate between should I do the good or the bad happen, and we do choose the good in this moment of grace, it's just like this wall of peace just washes over us. And it's like, this is exactly what I should be doing right now. And the enemy knows that this wall of peace will come, and so he tries to just dissuade us. The last thing that I'll kind of close with this rule number 1 is how the enemy worked in the temptation in the desert with Christ, right? Is he's proposing all of these goods to him. Turn this rock into stone. I know you're starving. Throw yourself off this cliff. God will save you. See how much he loves you. And then, hey, you could have all of this power in this world, Just bow down and worship me. So see, he's not rationally working with Christ. He's trying to hit him on the passions. And then what Christ does, right, is he rejects the temptation. And then what does the gospel tell us afterwards? Angels came and ministered to him. And so this is that little silver lining of hope that if we are willing to resist the bad and move towards the good, we can absolutely know with certainty that God will come with his assistance to console us because we have chosen him above the world, the flesh, and the devil. And so this concludes rule number 1. Stay tuned for rule number 2.